Story 1. The Midnight Call. Masha, a 20-year-old medical student, has been very busy with her studies in recent weeks. That evening, she was sitting in her small dorm room, which barely had room for both a desk and an antique bookcase. The lamp on the table gave off a dim yellow light that seemed especially cozy in this realm of books and study materials. Snow was slowly falling under the windows, creating a fluffy white curtain behind the glass that slightly diffused the light from the street lamps. In the room filled with silence, a sharp ringing of the phone was heard, which shocked Masha. She pressed her hands to her chest and looked at the screen. The number was unknown, and at that moment, fear pierced her. She slowly picked up the receiver and put it to her ear. On the other end, deep, even inhalations and exhalations were heard, creating a strange sensation, as if someone was breathing hard into the receiver. At first, Masha thought one of her friends was playing a joke on her. She said, "Hello? Who is this?" A muffled whisper that seemed distorted and tense answered, "I'm watching you." Masha felt her heart beat faster. She involuntarily looked around, expecting to see someone in the shadows. Masha hung up and started checking the locks on the doors and windows. The candle flame on her desk danced and cast strange shadows on the walls, increasing her fear. She tried to calm down, but soon the phone rang again. This time the voice was even more ominous and malicious. "Why did you close the door? You're already late." Masha turned off the phone with trembling hands and barricaded the door with a chair, feeling her legs buckle from fear. The sounds behind the door became more pronounced, the creaking of old wood, as if someone was trying to open her door. Masha spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, clutching her phone, ready to call the police at any movement. Her mind was filled with horrible ideas about who might be watching her and what might happen. When dawn finally came, she found that the room had become unusually quiet, and there was no trace of the mysterious observer. Story 2. Empty House. Sasha and his friends, Olya, Igor, and Vera, decided to spend the night in an abandoned house located on the outskirts of the city. The house was many years old, and its walls kept many secrets and stories. It was built in the middle of the 19th century and was known for its dark history. Several years ago, a family lived here, which disappeared without a trace. And since then, the house has become the subject of many rumors and horror stories. When they entered the house, the smell of age and decay immediately hit them. The floor was covered in old carpets, covered in dust, and the walls were covered in mold and cobwebs. Furniture was long since dilapidated, and in one of the rooms stood a broken chair that could have once been part of a dining room set. Pieces of wallpaper were torn off and hanging from the ceiling, adding to the gloominess of the house. Olya suggested that everyone sit around a large table in the central room and start telling scary stories to create an atmosphere. Soon, as they began telling stories, strange sounds began to come from other parts of the house. Cracking, as if something heavy was falling, creaking floors, and even the house itself began to smell of old smoke, as if someone had just smoked here. Igor suddenly disappeared from sight. They began searching for him, looking in every room and calling out his name. In one of the rooms, they found an old yellowed photograph lying on the floor. The photograph showed all of them, including Igor, in the same clothes they had worn that night. The faces looked fresh, but the photograph was clearly ancient, and its presence in this house was strange and frightening. Sasha and his friends continued to search for Igor, but he was nowhere to be found. At dawn, as they were leaving the house, they noticed that the photograph was missing. The friends were filled with fear and anxiety, and although they were safe, the feeling of incompleteness and uncertainty remained with them. They all agreed that they did not want to return to this house and would avoid it in the future. Story 3. Shadows in the Forest. Lena, a 24-year-old girl, preferred morning jogging in the forest, which was known for its picturesque paths and silence. On this day, she decided to change the route and run further along a lesser-known path. The forest was covered with a thin layer of morning fog which enveloped the trees and the ground, creating a feeling of mysticism and mystery. At first, everything went well, and Lena enjoyed her run. But as she moved forward, the forest became quieter and quieter, and the sound of her steps and breathing seemed too loud. Suddenly, she heard the crunch of branches behind her. Lena quickened her pace, but the crunch became louder and more distinct. It sounded like the steps of another person following her. Lena looked back and saw a dark shadow flickering between the trees. The shadow was of an indefinite shape, not like a normal person, but still had a certain ominous aura. Lena broke into a run. Her breathing became ragged and tense, and her legs began to give out from fatigue. With each step, the feeling of anxiety and fear grew stronger. When Lena finally got home, she was exhausted and very scared. Over the next few days, even while in her home, she continued to hear strange sounds like footsteps coming from different parts of the apartment. These sounds disturbed her peace and prevented her from sleeping. Nightmares also became her constant companion, and the feeling of danger did not leave her. Story 4. The Doll in the Attic. Katya, a 30-year-old woman, moved into an old house that she inherited from her grandmother. The house was ancient and beautiful, with high ceilings and massive wooden doors. When she began to unpack, she discovered that in the attic, which was filled with old furniture and boxes, there was a doll in a white dress. The doll looked creepy. Her face was cracked and her dress was torn. Katya decided to keep the doll as a memento of her grandmother, despite its frightening appearance. However, strange things soon began to happen in the house. At night, footsteps and rustling sounds were heard, although Katya lived alone. One night, waking up from a feeling of a presence, she discovered that the doll was standing in the hallway, although she had left it in the attic. The doll was motionless, but its eyes seemed to follow Katya, emitting an ominous light. Katya quickly returned the doll to the attic and covered it with a cloth. But the next morning, the cloth was removed and the doll was back in the hallway. This happened repeatedly, and Katya began to feel that her house was filled with supernatural forces. She tried to get rid of the doll, but the strange phenomena continued. Nightmares and strange rustlings haunted her, and she felt that the doll had attracted something sinister into her life. Story 5. Ghost in the Mirror. Maxim, a 28-year-old man, bought an antique mirror at an antique sale to add some antique charm to his new apartment. The mirror had a massive wooden frame with intricate carvings that looked like a piece of art. At first, the mirror pleased him with its unusual and elegant appearance, but soon Maxim began to notice that the reflection in it seemed to lag behind his movements. One night, waking up from a strange sensation, Maxim saw that his reflection in the mirror was not just reflecting an empty room, but was standing and looking at him. The reflection had an ominous smile and his face looked alive, as if something or someone was watching him through the mirror. Shocked and panicked, he covered the mirror with a thick cloth. But strangely enough, every time he took it off, the reflection continued to show strange and frightening scenes. While trying to get rid of the mirror, Maxim found that it disappeared and reappeared in different places in the apartment. At times, he felt that his reflection was moving independently of him, or worse, that someone else was standing in front of the mirror. These sensations led him to a state of constant fear and anxiety. Nightmares and a feeling of being persecuted forced him to seek help, but even then he was unable to get rid of the ominous mirror and its ghostly presence.
Story 6. The Secret of the Rottingham Spellbinder. The town of Rottingham, a cozy English place, was known for its history and picturesque streets. However, in the last few years, its reputation has changed and its fame is now linked to the terrible events that shook the entire region. The story begins in the late 2000s and 10s, when strange suicides began to occur in Rottingham. Each one was accompanied by shocking details and a consistent element. The victims left behind notes full of strange symbols and illegible predictions. The number of such cases grew, and soon the small town found itself in the spotlight of not only local but also international media. Each suicide was linked to mysterious symbols found at the scene. Some claimed that the symbols were ancient runic signs, while others saw elements of occult practices in them. The only thing that united all these symbols was their connection to ancient mystical teachings that claimed that knowledge of the future and power could be obtained through complex rituals. The investigation revealed that many of the victims were linked to a group of local spellcasters who were said to perform secret rituals and use ancient texts to obtain fortunes. These spellcasters lived in a small house on the outskirts of town that was known for its strange and sinister reputation. Locals reported seeing strange rituals and hearing strange sounds coming from the house, but no one dared to intervene. Soon, police and private detectives began their investigations, but none led to a clear understanding of what was going on. One note left by the victim was particularly disturbing. It spoke of the path of darkness, an ancient practice that allowed one to predict the future, but required sacrifice and extreme sacrificial ritual. Psychologists and occultists involved in the case began studying occult practices to unravel the mystery. They discovered that the group of spellcasters did indeed practice magic and used ancient texts that described rituals similar to those found at the crime scenes. The texts mentioned ancient gods and beings that could influence a person's consciousness and destiny, but the texts themselves were fragmentary and difficult to interpret. As it turned out, there was one man among the spellcasters who had studied magic and divination more deeply than the others. This man was supposedly the source of many of the divination that led to suicides. He supposedly believed that his knowledge could change fate, but instead it brought only destruction. By the end of the investigation, the leading hypothesis was that a group of witches were involved in complex and dangerous rituals that led to tragic consequences. The mystery of the Rottingham witches remained partially unraveled, and although some aspects were clarified, many questions remained unanswered. The town still remembers these events as something sinister and incomprehensible, and people still talk about how a night in Rottingham can be dangerous and full of secrets. Story 7. Demon of Woodland. The small town of Woodland, hidden among green hills and dense forests, has always been a quiet and peaceful place. However, in recent years, its residents have faced a horror that has turned their lives into a nightmare. A series of strange and brutal murders that took place in the surrounding woods have shaken the town to its foundations and created darkness and fear. The story begins in 2021, when the first body was found in the woods near Woodland. The body belonged to a local resident, and although the death initially appeared to be natural, it was soon discovered that the body had strange markings carved into the skin. These markings were complex runes and symbols that no one could identify. The next day, another body was found with similar markings, and soon the death toll rose to 10. Each new murder was accompanied by the same signs, and eventually it became clear that the murders had a specific ritual purpose. Police and experts who studied the crime scenes found traces indicating that rituals were carried out in secret places deep in the forest. These places were shrouded in mysticism and were known only to a few old-timers of Woodland. The locals began to talk about an ancient demon, which they said was summoned after a series of rituals. The legend said that this demon was a creature of darkness, capable of bringing suffering and death to those who broke ancient taboos. It is believed that each ritual performed for a specific purpose could summon this demon into the human world, and the murders were the result of its sinister influence. The investigation revealed that rituals related to occult practices were indeed being carried out in the forest. During the investigation, ancient books and artifacts used in the rituals were found, and it was established that they belonged to ancient cults that only a select few knew about. The murders were apparently the result of an attempt to summon a demon and gain power and knowledge from it. As the investigation progressed, more details about this ancient cult emerged. It turned out that the cult had been active in the region for centuries, but after a series of tragic events and persecution of its followers, its influence faded. However, a group of modern followers were able to restore some of the ancient practices and may have started the cycle of horror that has rocked Woodland. A particularly disturbing part of the investigation was that, despite their best efforts, the police could not find any of the culprits. Some witnesses claim to have seen strange figures in the woods and heard ominous whispers, but none of this evidence was reliable enough to identify the perpetrators. With each passing day, the fear and mystical horror only grew stronger. Locals began to avoid the forests, and the city was divided between those who believed in the demon and those who tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. Even with the cessation of murders, the city could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety and fear that had enveloped it in recent months. The mystery of the Woodland demon remains partially unraveled. Many questions remain unanswered, and the town continues to live in fear, looking around for explanations and possible solutions. The people of Woodland have learned to live with this dark history, which has become a part of their lives and a warning to anyone who decides to break ancient taboos.